not be with us tonight. Ms. Namika, would you take the roll call, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Clausen.
Here.
Ms. Phillips.
Here.
Mr. Schwartz.
Here.
Mr. Taylor.
Online.
Ms. Upchurch.
Here.
Thank you, Ms. Namika. To view this meeting's presentation documents, please access Board Docs. The link to the Board Docs website can be found via the D38 website, www.lewispalmer.org, on the Board of Education/meeting webpage. I'd like to make a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
Second.
Okay. I heard Mr. Taylor, so we'll give it to you, Mr. Taylor. Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay, hearing none. Ms. Namika?
Mr. Clausen.
Aye.
Ms. Phillips.
Aye.
Mr. Schwartz.
Aye.
Mr. Taylor.
Aye.
Ms. Upchurch.
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Schwartz, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Be happy to. I pledge allegiance to the flag
Flag
The United
of the United
States
of America,
and to the republic for which it stands,
one
one
nation,
under God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with
with liberty and justice for all.
all.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. All right, our first agenda item is the fall plan update.
Okay, Mr. Clausen, I will say a few quick words and then we will jump into our presentation. We want to thank everyone who's tuning in, as well as thank our board for your attention. And obviously there's a lot for us to cover tonight. But before we just dive into all of those details, I just want to start with a big thank you to really all our community, specifically those individuals that have been working through our work group format. We have about 65 District 38 stakeholders, including staff members, parents, students, and the efforts and the energy that our community is putting into the development of this plan. I just can't say enough of how much we appreciate the level of detail and attention that's going into every part of this plan. So we're excited to share where we're at as far as an update goes this evening. We thought the best place to start, though, would be to recap the survey results from the end of June through early July. So this survey was part of the original framework that was presented to our community back on June 23rd. And here with us this evening to share those results with us is Dr. Benton. So I'm going to allow Dr. Benton to take us through each of those surveys, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully everybody can view the survey data. And this is also going to be available, if it's not already, on our website. Quickly want to review the staff survey data. And if at any point in time anyone has questions, I can't see the chat, so maybe just hop in and interrupt me. Can everybody see the graph that's on the screen? Thank you, Casey. 2 thumbs up. So we modeled our staff survey after an industry standard survey that had been sent out to a variety of folks via HR. And we did modify it a little bit to make sure that it met our needs, but we felt like the questions were universal enough that we would be able to apply them to classified as well as certified employees. We also chose not to ask whether or not a person was certified or classified. We didn't want to add a lot of demographic data because we wanted people to give an honest response and not be concerned that we could determine if it was a certain respondent or not. So the first question asks basically a variety of questions around the environment, and you can see the questions on the next page. Whether or not folks feel confident returning to work, that we can bring them back safely, that we will have appropriate protocols in place, and that they will be instructed on those protocols. We also ask questions along the lines of being infected at work or taking it home to family members, how they might contract the virus from either coworkers or students, and how their job would be impacted related to if they tested positive for COVID. We also asked about childcare, we asked about job security, and we also threw in an extra question since we had an audience around the financial stability of Lewis Palmer School District. When you look at the data, what you see is strongly agree and agree is the blue and the green. Neutral is yellow, and disagree and strongly disagree are the light blue and the salmon color. As we look at the data, what we see is that majority of our staff feel like we will be able to return them with safety protocols in place. But there is, as you look at the data, a tendency towards concern over contracting the virus and taking it home to family members. So the way that we look at this is to say that we know we need to address safety protocols and make sure people understand what safety measures will be in place so that we can try to mitigate as much as possible in terms of transmission. Any questions about this graph before I move on? Okay. The next one is about those safety protocols that we might be able to put into place. And this is my running joke with this, so I apologize, but hands down, hand sanitizer is the winner. Hand sanitizer came out as 96% of staff said absolutely hand sanitizer is a must. So with this graph, the yes, in terms of yes, it should impact versus no. Yes is green, no is navy, and then not sure is yellow. When we asked about masks being required for staff, and again, this is pre-governor order, the staff was split. It was about a 40% for both and 20% unsure. When we asked if it was optional, there was a greater shift to yes, but now we know as of last Thursday that all staff will be required to wear masks or face shields given the governor's order. Face shields are important for us to consider as a mitigating tool because of students learning language, because of phonics instruction and those sorts of things. Disposable gloves, we also asked about that. We also asked about employee health screening, and overwhelmingly our staff said yes, go ahead and do some version of employee health screening. Also, they do want a detailed protocol for handling any kind of infection response and notification of that. So we feel like we have a comprehensive response to that as well within the plan. We also asked about allowing volunteers within the building, and you can see that majority of staff said that makes sense not to allow volunteers within the building. There was also a large percentage that said, we're not really sure. The last question for the staff survey asked, do they need to speak with someone from personnel regarding COVID-specific leave or workplace accommodations? And 92% of our staff said no, they do not. And another 8% or so said that they would, and they would also reach out directly or provided their email address. We had about a 40% response rate overall based on the 331 or so staff that answered the questions. Any questions about the staff survey?
Lori, this is Chris. Just a couple of points of clarification. If you could scroll up to the next graph, that one right there. So, I'm sorry, it's the one after this. I apologize.
You want the first graph?
Yeah, this one. What's the one that has the high yellow? I'm curious about that particular question.
Okay, so that one is, I believe my job would be negatively impacted if I tested positive for COVID-19. I believe that's the one is that the one you're asking about?
Oh, well, I wasn't sure. That's why I was asking.
This one? Oh, hold on just a second. Nope, it's this. I apologize. I'm having to scroll back and forth. I hope I'm not making anyone sick. Start from the bottom. I believe I will have adequate access to childcare. So one of the important pieces that we asked our staff as well as our families is access to childcare if we had to do some sort of hybrid model or remote learning model. So that's not sure.
And the yellow response, uncertain?
Yes, meaning that it probably depends on whether or not within remote learning, whether their own children would be in a remote learning setting or they would be working from home. So it's a big it depends.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry about that.
Dr. Benton, were these survey results, if I remember correctly, the family surveys were due back July 6th, or responses were cut off at July 6th?
Yes, the same date.
Okay, thank you.
Can you just review briefly what percentage of the surveys that were sent out were responded to?
So when you look at, we had about 336 staff members respond to the survey, and different levels of about 331 on average completed. So it's a very high completion rate for the staff survey. It's about 40% of our overall classified and certified employees, 45%.
Is there a magic number that you want to be over to get a relatively credible swath of the opinions?
I would say that this is a relatively credible swath of opinions. That, anytime you're doing surveys, it depends on, whether you can say, yes, this represents a population. And the fact that we're almost, between 40 and 45% is a very high response rate.
Okay.
As well as a high.
You're comfortable, you're getting the feel of the teams.
Yes, and when we shared this data with the different stakeholders, like with our instructional core and SEL group, there was a reflection that it was accurate.
Thanks.
Dr. Benton, just out of curiosity, I feel safe traveling to and from work. Can you speak to that one?
So some folks carpool or take public transit. We have staff who live all up and down the I-25 corridor who may carpool together. And so it is one of those standard questions around, are people concerned about actually accessing work?
Dr. Benton?
Yes, sir.
I feel confident about my job security. Can you just scroll up a little bit, please, on the screen? Okay. Well, I just wanted to see what category it was. Okay, perfect. Thank you. And help me understand that a little bit. Is it was the intent of that query to get a sense for how people would feel if they came down with COVID-19, or just based on the potential financial ramifications of the district due to reduced budget from Denver?
It's probably a combination of the two, actually. The question is a standard question that was asked. It's by Bob and I looked up the survey, and it's SHARM, I believe, is the company. And he could rattle off what that acronym stands for. But the reality is that we want to know where people are at in terms of job security. And I do think there are concerns over the economic impact, but also the pandemic impact.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Clausen, you bring up a good point, though, and it also relates to the last question of our first part of the survey here, which is, I feel confident in the financial stability of our district. So that was an additional data point that I do think goes a step beyond just how we're working through the COVID crisis, and speaks to kind of the overall staff vibe, if you will, toward where we situate regarding our budget and the uncertainties that are built into our management through this situation, as well as some other dynamics. So we didn't want to load the question per se, but you can see that there is a greater array of responses that show us that we don't have the same rates of strongly agree, and that there's definitely some uncertainty that's out there.
Thank you.
Any other questions related to the staff survey? I'm going to go ahead and move into the family survey. The family survey had multiple questions where we asked, first of all, how many students are within their family unit. And you can see majority of our families have 1, 2, or 3 students within the district. We then asked what grade level. And what you can see here is a fairly equitable distribution of what our normal grade levels look like in terms of population of students. So that curve is very similar to what we see in any given year for enrollment distribution. As you can see, the majority of our students are within that high school range. We did have about 1,950 responses to the survey, and that includes 28 responses for our Spanish-speaking families that were incorporated into these results. So as we keep scrolling, what we can see is we have the distribution of where students are going to attend. What you can see as well is a typical distribution of students for Bear Creek, Los Palmer Middle School, Los Palmer High School, and Palmer Ridge High School. And with that, that is a typical distribution of our largest population. The reason I'm pointing that out is that it's basically demonstrating a fairly when we talk about, what did you call it, Ron, a swath of results, and whether or not it was a representative swath of results. I think that's what the terminology you chose.
That's a technical term, Dr. Benton.
It's great. That's why I'm showing that to you, as you can see the distribution of results. So it's not necessarily skewed. We did have folks start to drop off the survey, just to let you know, once they realized there were additional questions. But what it does demonstrate too is we still had a fairly high percentage of completion. This demonstrates their likelihood to return in-person learning. And what you'll see again with the same exact color coding is the green and the navy is very likely, yellow not sure, unlikely, and very unlikely are the light blue and the salmon color. Keeping in mind that our transitions program is about 12 students. So that's the distribution looks different only because it's percentage based for the number of parents responding. We asked parents to rank their priorities in terms of the physical attendance, and it is a weighted prioritization scale, and you can see that in the table that's below. But what happens is it's basically reducing class size and facility cleaning protocols are the two highest aggregate ranking, meaning when you rank it 1 to 12, if you ranked it 5 and 6, and that was everyone else ranked something 1 or 12, it again is an aggregate ranking. And so you can see that those are important. As we looked at the data between elementary and secondary students, you could see that there was more of a distribution between the value of recess and mealtime for elementary families, and more of a focus on unique challenges related to certain courses like PE or band for secondary families. We started to see there was a shift in the ranking prioritization. And that's just all of the tables that demonstrate the distribution of responses. This was a transportation question we did ask, just trying to do for planning purposes. And about 40% of our families said, you know what, transportation may or is most likely something that we will be looking at for the fall. We also asked, we were again looking at distribution to determine did we have the right distribution of responses. And what we see here is that 800 or so families did respond that their children had some sort of plan. And we do see a typical distribution for the percentage of students who are special ed, gifted, and also who as well as have 504. So we did see a nice representation of those groups. We would have liked to have seen a higher representation of free and reduced lunch as well as English language learners. But we, again, percentage-wise, it is still fairly reflective. This question, the way that the data presents is a little misleading when you look at it in aggregate, but when you look at it in a disaggregated way, it's actually flipped. So elementary stated that they would prefer option 2, 2 to 1, and secondary said that they would prefer option 1, 2 to 1. But when you add them together, it looks like it's split 50-50, which is always interesting when you look at survey data. What that tells us, though, is when we dig further into the data, we asked a question around childcare, and that really was where the difference occurred. When you look at elementary, there's a higher propensity for needing childcare if we were to utilize option 1, and that's important for us to be aware of. Majority of our students do have access to devices. which is representative to what we've distributed in the spring, and as well as had access to the internet. So that one was the internet, this one is device access. And when we look at the overall data, it is fairly representative to the distribution that we made in the spring for both hotspots as well as Chromebooks. So what questions do you have about the family survey data?
I guess I'll ask a quick one. You said you had about 1,500 respondents, is that right?
About 1,950.
And if the average was probably 1.75 students per family or so, I'm just taking a swing at it.
Yep.
So we're looking at well over a third of the population, maybe
Yeah.
maybe
Correct.
representing closer to 50% of the population easy, right?
When you look at in terms of who accessed it, about the 1950 versus who completed it, which is about 1,730, it's fairly comprehensive.
Yeah. So this is great job. I mean, that's good response, especially in the summer.
Well, you know, I have to kudos to our families because I do think it's they shared the data and they answered and they took the time to give us their input. So
Great. Yeah, my rough math says we're over 3,000 students being represented.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to follow on. Is that correct? That it is approximately 3,000 students that are
If you were
by these surveys?
So we didn't so you could have had you could have had a parent from each household, or you could have had two parents from a household. So when I look at this, I would assume it's between, again, about a 40 to 45% response rate in terms of our overall population, because you may have had as I said, I didn't go through and sort in that manner. We didn't collect that level of data to determine if there were some duplicates for a household.
So we're not conclusive on it. Can you scroll up to the slide that was basically all green and explain that one more time? Because I frankly missed the message there.
This one?
Yes.
So this is the prioritization. There were 12 different priorities we had families rank. And within that prioritization, it's a weighted, basically a weighted prioritization from 1 to 12. And so the highest weighted ranking for items was reducing class size as well as facility cleaning protocols. And then you can look at the secondary ones, which were next tier, which would be seating students farther apart, the unique challenges, and then this one, which is students and masks. We're going to get more into that conversation here in a little bit.
So if I'm understanding correctly, this was what issues need to be addressed in order to be physically at school? Because it's not informing me. I'm a little lost, frankly, as to what this is telling us.
So what we were asking is we wanted parents to prioritize for them, for their own opinion as to, if I want my child to be in school, these are the things that are important to me to make sure that the school district addresses. So they ranked 12 different pieces. And then this data demonstrates the aggregate of those rankings of the 1,755 people who responded. So in aggregate, the more highly ranked the item in terms of by everyone, the higher the number within the graph. So
the x-axis is percentage of the.
So it's out of 12. So if someone ranked it highest, it's a value of 12. They ranked it lowest, and so what you can just see is that it demonstrates that reducing class size and facility cleaning protocols came out ranked higher than any of the other items in aggregate. It doesn't mean that parents put that exactly as number one. It means when you add up all of the responses, the next page details how the math is calculated. It's kind of wonky. But there is an aggregate average. So it's based on the percentage of respondents who rank something as number one versus number two versus 3.
And based on this data, is there a message? Because that's where I'm really still lost. I'm not sure what this is telling us.
What it tells us is that parents are saying that when we look at the data for elementary, things that were more important to them were things like, yes, keeping smaller classes, but also recess, also managing meal times, as well as cleaning the facilities to a deeper degree. When we looked at secondary data, we were able to determine that parents had more questions or higher priority for their student returning in-person learning by addressing unique challenges within different learning environments like PE or band, or more what we consider high-touch type classes. So the overall message for us is that facility cleaning, and if we can at all keep students in a reduced environment in terms of class size, which is reducing contact, those are higher priorities for families.
Dr. Benton, can you scroll down to the percentages? That one right there.
Mm-hmm.
So I was looking at where the highest score of priority was, and that was similar, if I look at this correctly, it was still, oh wait, go down just a itty bitty bit more. Okay, it's facility cleaning got very high rankings, right?
Correct. So when you look at the majority of the data distribution, parents ranked it within 1 to 6, meaning that they were more likely to rank it as a higher priority, which is why it received such a high total aggregate mark.
And then students not being required to wear masks ranked high as well.
Right. And again, this is also the survey came out before the guidance came out from the governor.
I was just looking at the aggregate between the students not being required, the students being required, the facility cleaning protocol, and then up at the top, the other one at the very top seemed to be reduced class size.
So it's also more highly weighted. You can see higher responses between rankings of 1 to 5.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting that transportation wasn't ranked as high.
Mm-hmm. And that's partly because, we had a quarter of our parents respond that transportation was a need. An additional about 15% said maybe, and then the remainder, about 60% of our families said that's not really an issue. Mm-hmm. And so that's reflective in the prioritization as well.
Are there any other things that jumped off the page, or when you saw these surveys that anything that made you go,
When we dug into the different levels, I don't think any of us were really surprised by the unique challenges being an important aspect for us to address for secondary, especially. We are able to cohort manage elementary a little bit differently. And then it didn't surprise me at all that recess was also a huge value to elementary families. And the younger the student population, the higher that value resonated. So again, we do look at data obviously in aggregate, but we do dig into the levels, and it's important. Each principal their data was shared with them by site so that they could then dig in further and see if there were any other, depending on comparing the data to the district to see if there were any differences for their own communities. All right, if there aren't any other questions with the family one, I'm going to move into the student one. So what's great about the student survey is that the students on the stakeholder group actually help craft the survey. And so there's some great questions in here that I did use student-friendly language with. And we did send this survey out to 7th to 12th graders across the district. And so you can see the distribution of the students who responded. We had 950 or so students who completed the survey, which is great when you consider the population of our 7th to 12th grade student body. You will see, though, that a higher propensity of upperclassmen did respond. And so that's just something to consider when we look at the data. This is a demonstration of where where they plan to attend in the fall.
Dr. Benton, can you just scroll up a moment, please?
Yes,
where
sir.
they're going to attend in the fall?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. It's about a 40% split with Livermore High School and Palmer Ridge. And then 20% or so for Lewis Palmer Middle. The students' responses around likely to return were very similar to the family responses, so there is consistency within that data. You can see that a percentage of students are not sure, unlikely, or very unlikely to return. It's about 20% of our student population in that category. We looked at our data for each of the secondary sites to be able to extrapolate potential programming, to be able to determine if online program would be a good fit for that student. And what we can see here is that we asked the question, how many plan to return in person versus part-time, as well as full-time online. And we did have a student who is planning to attend the Homeschool Enrichment Academy. Each school was given the data that demonstrates their percentage of breakdown for part-time as well as full-time. And you can see here that about 70% of our students said they were planning to come back in person, and another 30% will come back in some version of online. We asked the students to also rank what their priorities were. And what was interesting, as I said, is that yes, reducing the class sizes, as well as cleaning protocols, and then unique challenges related to specialized classes. So very consistent in terms of the data. We didn't ask them the recess question, but maybe we should have. We also asked them what they thought about transportation, and the data was very consistent with the family survey data as well, with a little bit higher for the maybe section. But overall, about 40% responded that yes, transportation could be a possibility for them. The other thing that we asked, and this is from the students, they asked how many students do you normally hang out with outside of school? So again, kid-friendly language. And what you can see is that majority of our students spend time with between 0 and 10 other students. And some of them, as I call them, our social butterflies, are hanging out with more than 20. And the students also wanted to know how often. And what you can see here is that there's a higher level of frequency of students, quote, hanging out with others. So about 81% of our students are frequently or sometimes hanging out with between 0 and 10 students. They also wanted to know if the majority of kids felt comfortable accessing food in the cafeteria. And yes, the 75% or so said yes, they would purchase food in the cafeteria. We asked them about the options for return, and the secondary students were very similar to secondary families, which meant that they preferred option 1, where they alternate a 2-day schedule. We also asked about internet access. The majority of them have access. Some of them skipped it. And I had people say, well, if they're accessing the survey, they've had access to the internet. And so they were finding a place to access. And this is access to devices. And again, when we look at it, it's about 6% stated they didn't have access to devices. If we were to extrapolate that out, it would be very similar to the number of devices we did hand out in the spring. What questions do you have about the student data?
Can you reiterate one time the scale of classes that you actually sent this to? I thought I saw early on that it was 7 through 12.
Yes, so we
elementary
did not go to elementary. It went to secondary for 7th through 12th grade.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question about the Hangouts.
Yes.
In senior living communities, at least in some of them, because this pandemic has lasted longer than originally hoped, they're allowing folks to interact in what they call their bubble, which is a small social circle. That could be as little as 5 and as many as 6 or 8. In this scenario, is there any way to know how common that 0 to 5 is. In other words, all the same people's in the same bubble in that analogy. Is there any way for us to, or is there any experience that says when they hang out with their friends, it's typically the same set of friends?
Well, I think the intent behind the question was to basically say how many students overall would you normally find yourself hanging out with. And so I think they probably interpreted it as the bubble. It's in terms of how many, in their language, I think that's what hangout means.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, could hangout be virtual versus physical?
I'm sure for some of them it could, but I think that the idea that they frequently hang out versus sometimes hang out versus never, I think that data in terms of the rarely. Like I said, these were their questions, and I honored their work, and I think to see.
Sorry, Dr. Fenton, not to cut you off. I just know from talking with our students who helped craft this survey that the intent behind that question was really to demonstrate that while our efforts toward cohorting may make a lot of sense as it takes place within the school day, that as we understand and can anticipate, we will have students that are going to be interacting with other groups of students that they may not be in a like cohort with. So as one student put it, does the cohorting hold value if we're going to be hanging out with each other anyway outside of the bounds of the school day?
Well, and I think one example of that is sports teams after school. I'm wondering if some of those hangouts with more than 20 people are the students on teams.
Yeah, and I think as we dive into a little bit more of where we currently sit in terms of how we're approaching that cohort dynamic, particularly at the secondary level, we recognize that there are significant challenges that we are trying to address, as well as some that we just can't, regardless of what we do, again, within the context of the school day, that at some level, we know our kids are going to be hanging out with other kids, whether they're in a like cohort or not. And those are things, obviously, that we are not able to mitigate.
And Dr. Benton or Dr. Summers, in terms of, we've had this, I think I saw it last week, and that was a completely different lens only a week ago. So having the survey close on July 6th, and here we are on the 20th, and the school doesn't open until the 19th. It's such a fluid situation. Can you speak to what aspects of this data that might be different given the current circumstances this week?
I think that does involve some degree of speculation. I think probably the best place for us to dive into more of what we know today and what we're working with as we work toward the opening of school and some of the trends that we're addressing within that transition. I think to some extent, I would anticipate that we would get similar data, even if we administered this survey now. But I think it would be a different type of survey that we would probably develop as well. So I'm not sure that that did everything that you were hoping to accomplish in addressing that question, but the survey data are helpful and definitely have been informative in the development of the plan. I do think that it's important to also elevate the fact that there are other drivers that are at work. And as we dive into more of what those plan details are, I think that'll help shape more of our next steps in how we talk about that.
Sure, thanks. And I appreciate that. It's such a fluid situation. I think it speaks to, as we get into the plan, highlighting some of the agility and the ability to pivot if and when we need to.
Absolutely. That's a great way to frame it.
So with that, if there are any other questions, I'm going to give my screen share over to Dr. Summers.
One quick question. Was there any common similarities across all three?
Yes. a majority of our students, as well as family members and staff, envision coming back to in-person learning and doing so as safely and as responsibly as we can. I would say, generally speaking, we're looking at about a 75 to 80% response rate that supports that return to an in-person learning environment. I also think it's important to mention that for those that do not envision that, that we value and understand that that perspective is one that we have to prepare for, that there are going to be families and students that are not planning on returning. And then to the extent that they can leverage both a part-time in-person as well as a part-time online, or it is an online option at that point, which we have actually had in our district for some time. We anticipate that there's going to be more students that are electing that option, or more families that are telling us that that's what they're looking for as well. So we recognize that it runs the continuum and that we need to be responsive to all of those dynamics. Okay, so with that, I would like to make sure that I can position this updated document that for those of you that are looking at where to reference that, if you log into Board Docs, there is a link to this plan. This plan will be circulated with all of our families tomorrow. Before I dive into more of the details, I would also elevate that we will be linking an enrollment form for our families, and we are asking for families to respond to that form, which really is going to specify their intent for the 2021 school year in regards to what enrollment option they will be pursuing as best they can tell us. That deadline for form response is going to be July 31st. And while on one level, I appreciate that this document will do a lot, I think, to address some of the questions, hopefully many of the questions that our families have, what I would start with as a preface is that there is no 100% foolproof plan, so to speak, in terms of every aspect of what the details are going to look like every day. There's still a lot that we are going to have to talk with our staff about and prepare for at each specific school site in terms of how we implement what these protocols and strategies will be. So I think that will come through more as we work through the plan so that you can understand different examples of where that situates. I would also elevate the fact that within this document, there are several links, and I'm going to do the best I can. We did not create a separate presentation that created this nice PowerPoint that allows us to go slide by slide. Instead, what we thought we would do is really work through as best we can, page by page, and summarize high-level information. And to the extent that there's questions about this information, please don't hesitate to speak up, and we'll do our best to respond to those. Joining me as we work through this plan will be Lori Benton as well as Rick Frampton, and this will, again, represent a lot of the work that has taken place in multiple work groups and continues to occur as we're learning more and adapting to the latest information, both at a local level, as well as how we're leveraging information from the state, Colorado Department of Education, and other resources that are important for us to factor into all of the details that we will be sharing with you this evening. So this cover page really just reinforces our preparation efforts and our plan, which currently is about returning back to school on August 19th. So for those students and families that elect to have their students attending school, our first day of school will stay the same. As of now, that is our focus, is making sure that we are doing everything that we can between now and just less than a month. I believe it's 30 days or 29 now. That's taking us toward that very first day of school. So more to dive into as we go through this. We'll talk through the in-person learning and online learning options in a little bit more detail. But we took a lot of information from different resources and guides, and you can see one of these linked here in the very beginning of our plan from the American Academy of Pediatricians. We see and agree that schools are fundamental to our child and adolescent development and well-being, and provide our children and adolescents with academic instruction, social and emotional skills, safety, reliable nutrition, physical, speech, and mental health therapy. All that to say that as we prepare for the coming school year, the goal is to have our students, to the extent that we can do this, physically present in school. And as you can see, we are also very cognizant of making sure that we do everything that we can within our power to afford ourselves every opportunity to maintain an in-person presence. And you will see as we work through this document that we ultimately do have to prepare for contingencies, because we recognize, as this is a public health crisis, that we cannot control every part of what happens in this place. And so we can work a lot to mitigate risk and to create a healthy and safety learning environment for our students, our staff, and our community. So you'll see a lot more of how those guidelines will present in an effort to not only come back to school, but maintain that in-person presence as best we can, as long as we can, as we work through this upcoming school year. Also important to mention that we are working as a community to take care of one another, and that is a core value. So we need everybody's partnership in this process. And while there may be individual aspects of the plan that not everyone is going to agree with, what we are still asking for and expecting is that we work together for the greater good. And we put that in terms of some of the more specific aspects of what this plan entails. Just really quickly, we are moving from phase 1 to phase 2 of this plan. So what we originally presented wasn't necessarily as much of the details as what I think people were looking for. This is a much more detailed document, but it's about as much detail as we can provide at a district level. Again, each of our school sites are now going to have to work at the next level in collaboration with our staff and our families to make sure that we're preparing to execute. So that is what our focus is shifting to, is how do we make sure that all of this can be executed? And a big part of that is training, communication, reinforcement, making sure that we have everything in place as we're preparing for that in-person return. You can see the guiding principles that we did outline from the very beginning. Those principles remain the same. So these 6 principles, we are going to speak to specific aspects within each and every one of these, starting with the health, safety, and well-being of our students, staff, and community. You can see additional links, including a lot of the... Sure. Sorry, Teresa, I missed. Did you have a question?
I know you were going over the core values and whatnot. I think it's on the next page. I was just suggesting you scroll down.
Okay.
Screen share.
Just real quick, I did want to point out, and as I show you this link to the additional resources, this is also reinforced in our website. So you can see a lot of the resources that helped create the details of this plan also linked through the website. So all of this information will be uploaded and available via our website as well. One of the other driving documents, and this document was not published until just middle of last week, but it's the El Paso County Public Health Department guidelines. Extremely important for us to make sure that we continue to partner with our local public health officials, and we will be showing you where there is connection to what's within this document, as well as what is reflected in our plan as we work through this. So without further ado, health, safety, and well-being of our students, staff, and community. So what I'm going to do is touch on the highlighted topics, starting with masks and face coverings, because that seems to be one that continues to be a representative dynamic. And as we all can appreciate and understand at this point in time, we are currently operating on an executive order released by our governor that is mandating masks for all 10 and older as of, I believe it was last Friday. So this is, at this point in time, how we're approaching the execution of that executive order, realizing that it will expire, but at the same, I think it's set to expire 2 days before the beginning of school, but at the same time, it very well could be updated and revised. And so with that in mind, as well as with all of the guidelines and what we continue to be hearing from our local health officials, is that wearing a mask is a key part, although only one, but it is a key consideration as part of a comprehensive prevention plan. So we recognize and understand that this may be challenging for some, both of our students and our staff members, especially among young children. But we are going to expect that staff and students are wearing masks to the greatest extent possible unless physical distancing can be maintained. You can see where masks will be required.
Can you scroll down?
How much further?
Maybe I'm still on the title page.
I am as well.
Let me,
We might have a delay in the buffering mechanism.
is it back on?
There
Yes.
it is. Yes.
I apologize for that.
There you go.
Okay, and I just got notes that are telling me that my screen sharing paused or timed out. My apologies on that. All right, so we are on masks and face coverings. So as I was saying, we understand that we are subject to the executive order that is currently in place. Here are the parameters by which we are working to create an expectation where staff and students are expected to wear masks, again, to the greatest extent possible unless physical distancing can be maintained. And what we would highlight in that is that there will be certain settings during the school day. And actually, as students are, if they are taking a bus, that would be one place where students would be required to wear a mask. And that would mean all students. We would expect masks to be worn entering or exiting school, when we're sharing hallways, or locker rooms, restrooms, and other common areas. This will have to be translated to different aspects of each school so that students and staff know when it's okay to not have to wear a mask. For example, when they're maybe in a classroom setting and directed instruction is occurring. In certain situations, masks may not have to be worn at that time. In other situations, particularly if there's a large class that's meeting and the physical distancing cannot occur, then we would expect that masks are worn at that point. Face shields are a potential alternative. But again, we want to make sure that we are starting from a baseline of masks will be a norm and a value that we will be encouraging and expecting as we work throughout the day. As I mentioned earlier, student populations who are unable to wear masks for medical or educational reasons will need to employ an alternate form of mitigation. And we do recognize that there may be, again, times when the mask is getting in the way of what is needing to happen educationally speaking. So you can see some of the other examples that are listed in that following bullet. We do expect, I'm sorry?
Question on that piece, if you don't mind.
Please. Yeah, please.
With respect for the alternate forms of mitigation, will that be managed on a building by building basis?
Yes.
Okay.
And to some extent, it could be within a building on a location by location basis, or other factors that need to be talked about, thought about, involving the specific staff members and students that we're working with at that particular point in time.
Yeah, so down to the most practical common denominator.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are asking that students and staff provide their own mask. In the event that that cannot happen, we certainly will have them available, but we also recognize that the supply is one of those things that we may not be able to keep up with that demand. So this is an area that we are asking for support from the community in that process. I want to be careful not to move too fast through this, but are there any questions around the masks or face coverings that I can help address?
Casey, can you speak to when we're talking about teaching our kids proper hand washing and whatnot, when the science says that wearing masks are going to that proper mask wearing includes changing out masks every day, making sure they fit snugly to the student's face, and how they take it on and off and touching their face. Is each building engaging in discussions on what that looks like?
Yes, absolutely.
And
That will be
how they envision that.
Yep, that'll be a component of what we will have to not only communicate, but work to model, to reinforce, to support. And I want to be clear that this is not something that we're looking at necessarily just from a top-down compliance angle. This is something that we are using as an opportunity to address more of the why behind it. And you brought up some excellent points around how we can reinforce the proper use of masks. And we recognize that there will be questions around that. And so it's our job to make sure that we are teaching and modeling that with less of a focus on trying to find people doing it wrong. I don't think we're necessarily trying to look at this as being mask police. In fact, that's not an effective way for us to set up the educational environment. However, there will be moments and times where we do have to make sure that that becomes a point of emphasis. And I think we have fantastic staff, and in partnership with our families and with our entire community, I think we can work from a place of how we look out for each other and how we care for one another in that approach. So I would expect that to be something that, again, is reiterated, particularly at the beginning of the year, as much as we need to. And pretty much it's like anything else. Once you learn a new habit and you're working with it, in a couple of weeks, it becomes just part of that. Here's what we're doing. And again, we're doing this because we want to make sure that we can stay in school and maintain an in-person learning environment as long as we possibly can.
I have another question. Colorado Department of Health released their guidelines on this, which mirrors the governor's order as well. And one of the reasons I was asking also is I want to make sure that as a parent and as a board member, I want to make sure that we're being mindful that we're not, that in the event we have a student that is doing the best they can, that we're not going to deny a child an education.
Absolutely. And again, we are not working at this from a finding fault or error with our students. We will work at it from a place of learning and growth, and making sure that we're doing our part to certainly if we have a student that just absolutely cannot wear one, we're not going to make a huge issue out of that. But again, we'll have other variables that we have to consider at that point in time. And it's one of those dynamics where we do have to really look at this from an individualized perspective. At the same time, what we need is everybody's support in that space and empathy, particularly for individuals that we know may not be in a position where they can wear a mask or a face covering at any part of the day. And if that's the case, again, we'll work directly with that individual student and support for the family, as well as making sure that our staff have what they need to do what we need to create that supportive environment.
And then one other question, I'm sorry to monopolize my time. I think Dr. Benton and Frampton will address students that are ESL and students, and our students that are special learner students that need accommodations.
Yes. So in addition to obviously the health and safety considerations, we will be working deliberately to ensure that the learning needs are being addressed and met. And you'll see that in a later part of our plan as well, reinforced in that language. All right, so I'm going to do my best to, because there is quite a bit still here for us to get through. Hand washing and sanitizing, as you saw in some of our survey data, but also just as part of the fundamental strategy, you will see and feel a increased emphasis in all of our schools to stress the importance of hand washing, find specific times within the day where hand washing is built as part of a routine, built into our routines. Making sure that if hand washing is not available, that sanitizing is taking place. Obviously, this will require a lot of monitoring of those hand washing stations and doing what we need to do to reinforce all the safety considerations, posters and other resources, et cetera, to really make that happen. That one's pretty straightforward. Physical distancing is another high leverage strategy, if you will, that is consistently stressed in all of the health department guidance that we're working with. And so as best we can throughout the day, yes, we will be making every effort when possible to encourage and maintain 6 feet of physical distancing between our students, our staff members, et cetera. What we also recognize, and the health department has been very practical with us on, is this may not be something that we can absolutely guarantee in every situation. So where you can't get 6 feet, 5 feet is better than none. 4 feet may be better than none. 3 feet. There's actual guidance within the El Paso County document that speaks to doing the very best we can, but acknowledging that there may be certain limitations that we are up against. And in those situations, then we will troubleshoot that and problem solve that as best we can. We are considering one-way hallways in schools where that's possible, where that's feasible. Again, that will be a site-by-site specific aspect of the plan. We will be designating specific building entry and exits that go perhaps a step further than entry and exit points that we have used previously. We are looking at, for elementary school, staggered recess times. There will be recess, there will be lunch to the extent that we can accommodate lunch in the lunch rooms. That would be our plan, is to maintain both a recess and a lunch time within those schedules. But again, that will be site specific in terms of at what points that will occur. We do recognize that for secondary, there may be limited or discontinued use of lockers, as well as limited time in between classes and the potential for staggered passing periods. At this point in time, we are starting the year off without assemblies or performances or all-school gatherings at the beginning of the school year. We're going to do what we can to still accomplish some of the interactions that occur, especially as we're welcoming students back, where we can leverage an outside venue versus having to do things inside. We'll be looking at those options. But as a general rule, we're going to try to limit large gatherings within each of our school environments. And again, you see the statement underneath physical distancing around each school communicating with their staff and community around more specifics of those plans. I want to take a moment now to talk about our health symptom screening protocols. You can see a link directly to the El Paso County health document. This comes directly from their document. Basically, we need to make sure that screening is a piece of that overall strategy. As we've talked at considerable length with our school staff around this, however, there is quite a bit to manage logistically with this. And so as we're starting the year out, we are not at this point in time going to conduct those symptom checks at the school environment. What we are asking for is partnership and intentionality with all of our students, as well as our staff members, to ensure that there is a self-screening guideline that will occur every day prior to arriving at a D38 facility. So we will be sending out these guidelines and reiterating what these expectations are. And again, that is something that we are stressing is of critical importance prior to a student or a staff member leaving to come to school. One of the things that we know is definitely part of this mitigation effort is that staff, students, anybody who is feeling ill and is experiencing in particular specific symptoms that are related to COVID-19 need to stay home. So you can see what those screening guidelines are. We are reiterating what things look like prior to coming into a facility, but should a student or staff member begin to feel ill during the day, at that point, we will be conducting an in-person screening in our health room. We will be contacting parents. We will be taking the temperature. We'll be also evaluating the student for that symptom or for the symptoms that are presented. We will have personal protective equipment specifically for our nurses or whoever is in the health room conducting that evaluation. And then we will also encourage that individual to reach out to their health provider and or consult with public health's disease program. And you can see the information there. So what the guidance again that we are receiving is telling us this is what we are expecting our students and our staff members to do. What they have given us is basically flexibility in terms of how we implement this. And so again, we're really at this point starting from a place of a self-screening step that our students and our families and staff would be conducting on their own. This next section really speaks to specific language, again, coming directly from El Paso County Public Health. And as you can see in bold, this timeframe cannot be overridden by any other authority and remains the express authority of El Paso County Public Health. And you can see the link to their guidance. And so the information that's here is literally word for word verbatim. But you can see, I'm not going to walk through every single one of these. In the event of a positive COVID-19 test result, you can see how each of those aspects of what happens then fall out in the event of a positive result, in the event of a negative test result, but symptoms with no other diagnosis, for people with a probable diagnosis without lab confirmation who have COVID-19 symptoms, but did not seek medical care. And then lastly, for those with other diagnosis to explain their symptoms. The bottom line on all of this is we're looking at an extended period of time out of school for the individual or individuals that are involved. And that includes siblings or household members that will also be excluded in the event that there is the different criteria that you see there listed. So this will be something that we anticipate having to continue to communicate, but a lot of times it's going to be when a situation comes up, what do we do at that point? Now this will connect to another section later in our document as well. But at this point, this is just one more health and safety protocol that we will be implementing. And I'd like to, if I can, just kind of hustle through the rest of these because they're all very straightforward. Bottom line is from a cleaning and disinfecting approach, we will be ensuring ongoing cleaning and sanitation of commonly touched surfaces. That will be throughout the day. We will be reducing the frequency of touching surfaces. We'll be communicating more specific cleaning protocols specific to classrooms around band, PE, science, etc. Cleaning and disinfecting will be something that we will be extremely diligent about and make sure that we have the staffing and the clarity on what those expectations are up and down throughout the day. I want to talk a little bit here about cohort management, but it's also a component that still is something that I think we will be communicating more information about, particularly as it pertains to secondary, because there's different dynamics at play in elementary than our secondary school environments, middle and high school. But essentially, cohort management is really about limiting the number of students who are in regular contact with each other by keeping them in groups and cohorts. It assists more in contact tracing. It's not necessarily a mitigation of the transmission of the virus. It comes into handy more so in the event that somebody were to acquire COVID. How do we work with public health at that point to determine exposure of other individuals? So at a broad level here, elementary students, for the most part, will be kept in a cohort class to the greatest extent possible. So the same group of students with the same teachers day in, day out. Efforts will be made for secondary students to remain with similar cohort groups. However, and we're just briefly saying here, students will still be scheduled in both core and elective classes. Basically, what we're looking at is more of a broader cohort management design for our secondary level, because at some point it becomes almost counter to what we're trying to accomplish in returning to in-person instruction if we create too restrictive of a cohort management plan. So there's just not the same level of assurance that we can provide with our secondary schedules the way that they exist. I will tell you that our secondary schools will be talking a lot more with their staff about how we plan for what cohort management does look like. And this is where I'll put another plug in for making sure that we are getting the most accurate information from our families in terms of your intent to enroll, either full-time in person, or if it's a part-time option, a lot of that part-time election will factor into the way that we design class size and maintain some degree of cohorting as best we can throughout the day. So that's just an additional level of information that we're going to need before we can have all of that detailed in terms of what the student schedule looks like and where they see themselves from point A to point Z from one day to the next.
Can I jump in real quick and ask a question?
Yes.
So as the student survey pointed out, I think if I'm understanding that, we're recognizing that a lot of our students, most have established friendships or relationships that they'll continue to socialize outside of the school. So cohort management becomes an even bigger challenge. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and the experience of middle school and high school is predicated upon students being able to access both their core and elective classes of their choice, insofar as you're not going to be able to have one set of students that is following that same set of students from the beginning of the day through every class that they attend. So it just becomes very difficult to manage in terms of trying to restrict that cohort. Inevitably, if you're going to have more than one class in a day, which we will, you're going to have that class that's going to go to the next class, and the kids that were in the previous class and whatever next class they're in. It's just the nature of the way those schedules are designed. And to date, we do not have that much better of a game plan to be able to afford that type of cohorting. So again, what I would say is cohorting by itself is not about mitigating transmission of the virus. It's about making sure that we can trace or partner with public health in the event that there is a positive case. So by following all the other criteria that we have already talked through, that becomes more of the emphasis as opposed to cohorting being the only way to manage that limited interaction from day to day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Casey, just to clarify so that I understand completely as well, the cohort management in terms of contact tracing and whatnot, if the tighter the cohort, the larger the chance you have of, say, keeping a school site open. If there is an outbreak in a smaller cohort, you could potentially isolate but not necessarily shut down the entire school. Is that an adequate?
That is one way to think about it. Yes. And as we get into the potential of what happens in the event of an outbreak, what I can tell you is, well, I can fast forward if you want me to.
It's okay. It's okay. I was just thinking in terms of consequences. I was thinking that, so it's okay.
One of the potential benefits of cohorting would be that if we did have to shut down, there would be the potential of only applying that to the specific cohort of students or staff that have contracted the virus. As we talk more about how that potential outbreak is defined and then managed, I think you'll see how all of that connects a little bit later.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we're getting to the end here of at least principle number one. So again, we talked about limiting large group assemblies and gatherings. CHASA will provide guidance that we will follow regarding athletics and activities. We are, at least as we're starting the year out, going to limit volunteer guest teacher. By guest teacher, we mean not sub-teachers, but teachers who are coming in as guest speakers or other additional support, and visitor access to D38 facilities. So we are limiting that. We're not completely restricting that. But one of our strategies that I don't know that I spelled out in detail earlier is that if you're visiting a building, we are going to limit where that visitor may be able to go. So it may be limited just right to the main office. We would expect the visitor to have a mask on and to have also self-screened prior to arriving. Also, we are anticipating virtual meetings in lieu of those large group gatherings. So an example of that would be back to school night. Some of the other typical events that we kick the year off with will be modified as we're starting back in August into September. Our nutritional services program will be in place. We'll be allowing students to access food services. We are going to prioritize lunch accounts being used as opposed to the handling of cash. We're still figuring out exactly what will be available to students in the form of the meal itself. So to the extent that box or bagged breakfast and lunches will be served, there will be still an accounting for a hot meal for students that we're trying to limit just meals that only exist within a sack, so to speak, sack lunch. Condiments will be available, but in individual packages, et cetera, et cetera. We are going to limit access to microwaves, hot water dispensers, and toasters. We're going to do the best we can to also accommodate the physical distancing protocols within the lunchroom setup. Transportation will, at least right now, operate off of a normal bus route in compliance with health and student safety protocols. So we are going to require our drivers to wear masks as well as any student that is riding the bus. We will be cleaning in between our high and middle school and elementary routes. And then we are going to look really closely at the ridership. And so we do anticipate that there will probably be less riders than we have been operating with. And so we will make adjustments to our schedule as necessary based on what that ridership will present as. And then,
Can I
yep.
ask a quick question before you move into buildings?
Sure.
On the nutrition, will students, or did we get clarification whether students will still be allowed to have lunches off campus?
We are at this point in time going to allow off-campus lunch.
That makes
And
sense.
part of the rationale there is we don't have the space to be able to accommodate all of the students in one setting. Now, we may be adding a lunch. We may be having to adjust other parts of the schedule. But at this point in time, we are not envisioning lunch to be served directly in classrooms. That may have to happen in certain situations. Again, a lot of that is going to be site by site, school dependent. But yes, that is our initial stance on off-campus privilege.
Thank you. Sorry to have interrupted.
Sure. No, that's fine. Buildings, just gleaning over this real quick. Hand sanitizer stations and healthy habit signage, arrival and dismissal. Again, we'll maximize physical distancing. We are asking that drinking fountains be used only as water bottle dispensers. Where we do have the water bottle dispensers, that will be what we stress is encouraging all students to bring their own water bottles, and we can keep them filled up so that they can stay hydrated throughout the day. Facilities will be cleaned again with appropriate products throughout the day and each evening. And then our grounds teams will continue to monitor playground equipment and other outdoor areas for other hazards. So I think that may be where I am going to hand it off. But before I do, into our second principle, is there any other questions related to everything that was just covered in the health and safety section?
One more question on the screening. I wanted to make sure I understood. So if a student ends up with a temperature, are we going to do we have to have that student have a COVID test before returning back to school?
Not necessarily. What we would be doing at that point is working with the family that's involved, and really what we would encourage at that point is their coordination with their healthcare provider. And what we obviously do not want to see is the student coming back to school exhibiting any symptomology. So erring on the side of safety, while we can encourage that test, Unless there are other signs that are at play, we wouldn't necessarily jump to an automatic requirement. And as I'm saying that, I want to double check with our nurses to make sure that that is absolutely how they are approaching it. But that would be something that we would, again, be consulting with that student's family on to make sure that we're all on the same page.
AC, I have, oh.
Go ahead, sorry.
Right there, stay on that page. So at the bottom where it says each school will communicate, I know it's a concern of a lot of people in the community as to the short run up to August 19th. And can you speak to, you know, a ballpark of when specific school plans will be rolling out?
So I think it depends on what are the specific aspects of that plan that people are looking for. I can tell you that, again, the information that we will get from the enrollment form will be a driver for how many students we are preparing that are returning 100% in person, and students that may be coming at it from a part-time angle, and how their schedule will align to the way the day will work. I hesitate only because if I create a date right now that says here's when it's all going to happen, I worry about our ability to maybe not have it completed by then. What I would also emphasize is that we need, at this point in time, we have done, I think, as much as we probably can do in most respects with this district level plan, recognizing that we want and need our staff members to be part of the actual, how then do we implement this within specific classrooms, within specific times of the day, et cetera. Now, our staff are not scheduled to return back to work until August 12th is their first official day. We're going to talk in a little bit later in the document about how we're trying to approach partnering with our staff to give them some additional time that can be built into how they're returning. So here's what I'm hesitating to do. If there is a level of detail that people do not feel like they're currently working with that we can provide, we'll do everything we can with our administrators and the staff in the school to create that response. But there's still a lot that they have to do, and I don't want to create that burden of it's going to be right away. So it'd probably be more detailed out the very first week of August. But if there's questions that are of an immediate nature that people have, they are certainly welcome to reach out to their specific school staff. I would just personally ask for a little bit of space and grace, because it may not be an answer that we're going to be able to automatically generate all at once.
Sure.
Right out of the gate. So
yeah, that's very helpful.
Trying to create as much of a buffer is the best way to say it. Just being real.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of flexibility and patience from all sides and angles that, you know, everybody can bring to the table.
We appreciate that.
Yeah, and this might be a question for Dr. Benton. I know that there are high schoolers wondering about their school class schedules and when they come out. I actually don't recall when they usually come out, but do you anticipate that that would be on a similar timeline, or will it be just right before school starts that they'd be able to know what classes they're in and what their class schedules are?
So my understanding is that normally schedules are released usually the day before processing, and then students can determine if they need to make schedule changes. But I know that we are also looking at our processing differently in terms of students coming in and how they pre-register for things or get a parking pass. And so I think what you can expect is that the schools will communicate the timeline of when a student can log into Infinite Campus and see their schedule. As part of that, what Casey's talking about, that phase plan. So we do, and Casey, if you just want to scroll right into the next place, maybe this is a great opportunity for us to move into number 2.
Go for it.
So I think you all have seen this chart, but basically it just demonstrates the different enrollment options that students will have. Preschool is in person because we can keep it. The concept of cohort management is very strong within the preschool setting. And Melissa Gibson Steiner will be working with our 3 preschools to make sure that they have the protocols in place for safety and for cleaning and for snack distribution and that whole component. Elementary options are full-time in person at school or full-time online. And we also have our part-time homeschool enrichment academy that will still run on Thursdays. The full-time online option will be a mirror of what students are receiving within the K-6 setting. K-5 in particular, the curriculum that we are utilizing is parallel to what's being offered in brick and mortar in person, except for literacy. And as you have heard, the literacy conversation, we have multiple literacy programs at the elementary level. And so we'll be looking at adding a supplemental literacy program. And obviously, at this point in the ball game, we've never had an online elementary. So now we do. We are an approved program through CDE. And thanks to the instructional coaches and the elementary principals for creating that program. And we applied and did receive approval for a program to have beyond, hopefully beyond COVID. The middle school option is anything from full-time in person to part-time to full-time online, as well as our part-time homeschool enrichment programming. And our middle school options, in the past, we had no more than 20 part-time students accessing our online programming. And so it was all very supplemental. And we contracted with Colorado Digital Learning Solutions, which is a state-supported BOCES that is a state-supported grant that has Colorado educators and is aligned to Colorado standards. With the middle school programming, though, and looking at potential numbers, our hope is that we can offer programming that is designed and executed by our teaching staff. And so as we look at numbers, we'll have more information, and that's one reason why we need parents to fill out that intent form that's going to go out tomorrow. That will help inform shaping that curriculum. As I said before, it was all very supplemental. At this point, though, we know that one of the great pieces of adopting our curriculum in the last few years is that there are digital components that students can access in an online platform. And so we would want to utilize those resources, including the newly adopted math and English language arts programs. The high school option is also full-time to part-time, either in person or online or a combination. And we have had our online courses, all of our core courses are mirror in-person learning in terms of the curriculum that's utilized with those. We do contract with some, with Colorado Digital Learning Solutions for any supplemental courses that we are unable to provide, but those are considered elective or supplemental. We also do contract for some of our AP courses so that students can access AP programming. I've had questions about that, and we do offer that. For online programming information, there is a process for parents to and the students to apply for that because it is a different process. So if you keep scrolling, one of the biggest pieces is that as we continue to plan for different levels of programming, attendance is still a requirement. And so we will be working to determine attendance practices and policies for any kind of in-person, whether we go to remote learning or online learning, and how we make sure that we meet state expectations in terms of that. We also want to make sure that any students who have learning gaps, that we address that. The group of teachers that we've been working with really focused on making sure we assess our kiddos in a formative manner and plan our programming and our curriculum and intervention based on that. So not teaching backwards necessarily, but really looking forward to this current grade level and the current grade level content and filling gaps as we go. There's also a portion in here about our special population students, and it's really important that we let people know that we will work within the students' plans to determine if we can provide a learning environment for reasonable accommodation and services to be met. And so the case manager, if a student who, if they do qualify for a plan, will help determine appropriate accommodations for programming. And in terms of progress monitoring and accountability, one of the things that we do see essential is making sure that we do provide assessment data. So through our PSAT, our local PSAT, making sure we're prepared for the SAT in September, as well as the PSAT in October. NWA, as well as Acadience, which is the new name for DIBELS, which is our literacy assessment for K-3. The difference is that we'll have to look at how we go about giving those, but we are going to still see that that's a priority to help our students be able to set academic goals and get the data to our staff to be able to determine if any intervention is needed. There is a responsibilities chart that is linked within this section to help our staff, administrators, counselors, our teacher leads, and our teachers understand the distribution of responsibilities within the first 3 weeks of return. And you'll see it's pretty heavy for administrators and teachers. And the idea is that we want to demonstrate that we've hopefully thought about, and this was created by our group that of teachers and administrators and counselors, to try and help clear up exactly what everyone should be doing and by when. So this is the generic one for K-12, and the principals will be working, they've been working within their group to have an elementary option and a secondary option. And as they work through those, they'll be communicating more specific timeline and detail to each of their staff. The Learning Services Department will then support the professional learning that staff need related to that. So that's number 2.
I think that sets up Mr. Frampton for our focus on mental health, social, and emotional learning supports.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Summers. We have a really an amazing group of folks who are focusing on the social emotional learning aspects of our return to make sure that we're meeting the needs of kids, not just academically, but also the social emotional needs. There are many known and probably even more unknown impacts to the fact that we haven't been in school since March. So we broke this plan into 3 different levels: the why, the what, and the how. And the why really is, how are we going to help kids come back in a different world than what we left it, and be prepared for that. And so we are putting together all the what's and the hows on how to make that happen. One thing I've heard from teachers more than anything else is we had a high level of success when we did the remote learning in the spring, primarily because we had relationships with the kids. We knew the kids. We had all fall and most of winter to learn what motivates kids, know how they learn, and how to individualize the lessons to meet the needs of kids. Our big concern is if we were to have to do a closure early in the fall, we wouldn't have that opportunity or background to get to know kids. So we are going to make one of our number 1 priorities is to really carve out the time necessary to get to know our kids as learners and as individuals, and make sure that we are developing those relationships if we have to ever go into a remote environment, so we can lean upon that. The what, we believe that social emotional learning shouldn't be a standalone. It shouldn't be something that occurs in a counselor's office, in the main office, with the social worker, counselor, school psychologist. It really needs to be something that's incorporated and integrated into what we're doing every day in every class. We feel that our teachers are the ones who get to know the kids. They get to know the families better than anybody. And when it comes to being able to make those connections and support kids from a social emotional standpoint, our teachers are the best equipped to do that. So we're going to empower our teachers to do that to the best of their ability. And we're going to train them on some techniques and some strategies that'll be helpful in identifying when a child is needing additional support, and how to provide that and be the first line of defense in providing that support. Obviously, there's going to be times when students have needs that are greater than what a classroom teacher will be able to address in the classroom. And we're going to have a goal of freeing up our mental health professionals, our psychologists, social workers, and counselors, freeing them up to have the opportunity to address those kids who have higher level needs upon return. So that's going to require us in our scheduling to ensure that there's more flexibility with their schedules, and they're able to respond to those everyday crises that do occur in schools.
Rick?
How is, yes, go ahead.
This is Chris. I've held on to this question because this what seems to be contradictory to the value of our online learning. And so I wanted to raise this question, and it's threefold, and it may be include everyone on the answer. So when I look at the learning options, one of the questions I have is, we have good success with the Home Enrichment Academy with homeschooling. And has there been discussion about having the Home Enrichment Academy be supplemental to full-time online for the very purpose of this statement that you make in the what, and that is, you know, the investment in developing relationships is equally important to the academic content, which, you know, comes back to that concept. If you're full-time online, then your relationships are going to be much different than in school or in person. And so that's my main question. I mean, have you considered a full-time online that is somehow associated with the Homeschool Enrichment Academy, which seems to be spot on to what you're talking about under the what category?
So if I may answer that, the homeschool enrichment program is a separate program for homeschool families where they it is a supplemental program. The online component, depending on the level, if it's K-6, they will have enrichment built into, or specials built into the programming. But I think the key piece is that they will also be assigned a mentor where they are connected to their home school, and they're allowed to attend different components of this homeschool in terms of activities or that sort of thing, to whatever level of comfortability that their families have. We are also working on the middle school component where they also had an online mentor assigned to them. But given the numbers that we're expecting, we would also then have group cohorts where the students can get to know other online students in an online capacity. And so one of the pieces that what we have realized is that we have some parents who do not want students to attend campus at all. And we have some parents who want students to attend campus in a part-time manner. So we do supplement part-time at the secondary level already between grades 7 and 12. So there is an intended level of connection where students meet with their mentor weekly. They also can connect with their teachers. And we are looking at adding that additional layer of connecting in cohorts with the students who choose online programming. So I hope that helps answer that.
Well, Dr. Benton, just to be clear then, this is virtual meeting, not...
Correct.
Okay,
Correct, yes.
So what you're saying, I think, as I understand it, is we're making every attempt possible for social and emotional learning support virtually.
Correct, as well as in person. So part of what the design of our programs, and the reason they're a program and not at their own school, is that the students are still connected to their school of attendance. So
I'm sorry. I'm going to restrict my question a bit. I'm only talking about the full-time online.
Okay.
I recognize the SEL for in-person. I get that. I'm really talking about how does this impact those who have chosen to be virtual?
Correct, and what I'm giving you information about with the full-time elementary or full-time secondary is that there are built-in SEL components within the programming in a virtual manner.
And your professional opinion is that's sufficient?
Well, if a parent is choosing to have their student attend in a virtual manner and is not comfortable attending in a face-to-face manner or in-person learning, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that student's successful.
Understood. I really do understand that. But the whole section about mental health, social and emotional learning supports is different depending on the school choice that parents and students select.
Yeah, and Chris, I'll jump in. I would agree that a full-time online environment is not the most ideal circumstance for children to have the opportunity to interact with peers interact with adults in a natural in-person way. So we can't meet those needs in the same capacity or in the exact same manner. So what we're going to do is we're going to be intentional and deliberate in doing that in the online environment to the best of our ability. But that has been a criticism and a concern with online learning as the only way that students are accessing their school. So there are ways that we can overcome that in the online environment, but we can't replicate an in-person environment online.
I totally understand, Dr. Frampton, and I literally appreciate what your answers are, that you're doing the best you can if that's the choice of the parent is full-time online. We're not dismissing the what, it's just virtual, but it's still there.
Correct.
And we are going to dismiss it. We're going to be intentional and deliberate with it. It just, despite all those efforts, it does have its shortcomings. You're correct.
Understood. And that raises a question. And again, I heard Dr. Benton say that the parents selected full-time online because they want that. That's their selection for their safety or for their whatever choice they're making. The question I was really still asking was, have you considered an option where there is I'll call it a online school enrichment, similar to homeschool enrichment, again, by choice? Is it something we have considered offering as a choice?
And for clarity, Chris, when you say that homeschool enrichment actually has the students in person 1 day a week.
Understood.
So if in fact a parent would be interested in accessing some sort of online some sort of in-person opportunities, because the online will be affiliated with their school and there's mentors available, there are ways that we can make that happen. That's what I heard Dr. Benton say.
It just hasn't been, I didn't read it that way. That's the reason I asked the question, right, is I don't see that as an option, but if that's something that will be proffered, then great. That was the question. Whether or not people choose to do it is another question altogether.
Right. And I'm going to take a note of your point here and see if we as the SEL committee can't communicate this a little bit more clearly for a future version of this document.
One more thing just to throw out there. I don't know that it completely addresses every part of what we're talking through, but what I can share is that I know that our, specifically at the elementary level, our principals are talking about is making sure that we have some kind of way of checking in and understanding how it's going for our students, in addition to all of the other strategies that we're going to employ. We understand how big of a shift that environment will be for those that are selecting it. So we stand ready to understand how it's going, where it's working, where it's not, and being able to problem solve that in a responsive way. Because I would hesitate to try to develop too much of a programmatic response without first understanding more of what the needs are. And I just know that that is a priority as we continue to look at whatever the preferred enrollment approaches, that we stand ready to partner with our families and understand where we're making it happen or where there's need and how we can problem solve to address those needs. So I would just say that that's something that you've called out. That's a real dynamic that we need to be attentive to, and we'll continue to learn together through that and figure out, again, what's working and where we can improve.
Chris, I appreciate your line of thinking, especially because I know through this process since early June that, you know, there are families making choices based on absolute medical necessity for the health of their kids or for the health of someone who is in their home. So I think this speaks to the overall value statements and the culture that the district is trying to create to really serve every student. And I really appreciate that sensitivity.
Yeah, I've had numerous conversations with parents already up to this point, and this is not an easy decision. I appreciate the challenges in making that decision, as you have to weigh out many factors in your household, and anything we can do to help with that. So that's exactly why our social emotional learning team is put together, is how are we going to address the impacts that those decisions have on kids and families in this environment. Any other questions before I jump into the how?
I have questions, but I'll wait until you finish.
Okay. The how, a focus of our team was, we do not want social emotional learning to turn into one more thing that's being heaped on teachers' plates in this incredibly challenging start in the fall. So what we're hoping to accomplish is by using existing curriculum that all of our schools already have in place. So we have responsive classrooms in like Prairie Winds, Capturing Kids' Hearts, Mental Health First Aid, are programs that are already in place, and the school cultures have already embraced those social emotional learning curriculum. So what we're hoping to do and what we're planning to do is carve out some time in the teacher pre-service days to ensure that all teachers are trained or retrained in the curriculum that is being used in their school, as well as connecting that to the unique aspects of COVID and the closures. So we're working, the team is right now in the process of researching how those curriculum are addressing these concerns, and we are going to make sure that we incorporate all of that into the teacher training, and we're going to have some time at the beginning of the school year to make sure we cover that base. Another area for the how is we have, especially at our secondary level, we have some very strong peer-to-peer options available for kids, whether it be Link Crew, Sources of Strength, QPR, are different programs that we have for peer-to-peer support. And we're going to make sure that as we train kids on these programs, as we always have, that we're going to also incorporate ways for kids to identify concerns amongst their peers and utilize them to help connect kids with adults that need when they need additional help. And then lastly, we're also going to be intentional and deliberate about how we support our staff. And we're going to ensure that we're looking out for each other as staff members and checking in. And we're working with the principals and administrators of the buildings to make sure that that is an intentional and deliberate component of our day as adults. So we're taking care of each other in this process, because this is hard on everybody.
I'm going to scroll, Rick.
Yeah, we have a fancy little chart that summarizes all that I've talked about.
Great. What questions are there?
Well, I had a couple questions. First, I want to start out with saying that I thank you so much for recognizing and emphasizing the value of ensuring that we're aware of the social emotional needs of our students and our staff. That there is no perfect plan, and we're working through this, and it is fluid. It's not just that it's fluid because it's fluid everywhere, it's fluid globally, and globally we recognize that education and in-person education is essential to that component of students. And to that effect, my question, Rick, is, then maybe this is a weeds question, but how are we with our students that are our SEL students that may or may not be able to, or are struggling with our guidelines? I was reading that we would be working, I was really encouraged that we'll be working to ensure that their IEPs and 504s, if needed to be updated, will be to ensure that we're doing the best we can for our students. And I, as a parent, am appreciative of that, and want to make sure that it's important that we acknowledge that that's a collaboration that is truly between a parent and their students and the teachers and the staff members in order to be successful. My question is, what about somebody who's not included on that IEP team? Let's just say, for example, a student in sixth grade, for example, maybe that student's not wearing a mask because they have a special needs, or it's not feasible for them to wear their mask. How will we help to ensure that the rest of the building staff knows that student is hasn't, I don't know if I want to use the word exemption, but that there is measures in place for that student?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's going to be many students that don't currently have a plan that very well may need to have a plan developed in this new environment because of asthma, for example, and they haven't had a plan developed. If we have students with medical needs in which we have to take that into consideration, we put what's called a reasonable accommodation in place. And that reasonable accommodation can be a variety of different things. It could be greater social distancing. It could be a few minutes earlier passing period so they're not in crowded halls and that sort of thing. And we already have very robust processes for developing plans and accommodations and communicating those plans. If you were to go into our Infinite Campus student information system, there's flags across the top. So if you were to look up a student, you can see flags for students who have unique medical challenges or unique learning challenges. And there are going to be, we already have really solid systems in place to ensure that communication is occurring. But your point is a good one in which we're going to have to continue to ensure that our communication is solid, because we don't want a student to be reminded on many occasions to put on a mask when we've already established that wouldn't be appropriate. So we're going to have to continue to reiterate and use the existing systems in a way that'll support those kids as well.
And thank you so much. And I don't know if this is a question that's more appropriate for you or self or Dr. Benton. Can somebody speak to, if we have a student who is struggling online and wants to jump back in learning, or is struggling in learning and needs to go online? I know that's been discussed in some of the committees. I'm sure that parents are going to be asking that.
So ideally, we would want students to stay within the same format for an entire grading period, right? That's ideal. But we also understand that that life throws you sideways sometimes. And sometimes an online setting is working and sometimes it's not, sometimes in person. And if students have medical conditions or parents have medical conditions or grandparents have to come live with them, there's all kinds of pieces that could contribute. So I think for ease, we should say, oh, well, gosh, it should be at a grading period. But in reality, we know we have to be more agile. We know that this is the year of agility. That's what we're calling it. And that we have to be able to shift for kids. And sometimes that's going to make the adults a little scratchy, one of my favorite words. But we have to be willing to do that for our students. And I think our staff, when you get to the heart of a child, they're willing to make that shift. And it's not easy, right? It's not an easy transition. High school is one where it's a huge challenge to do that midstream, but we do have certain situations where we can do that if necessary. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, that does answer the question. I have a feeling that that'll be a question that gets brought up. I've heard it asked several times. And I think under the heading, the progress monitoring and accountability measures, that's really, those bullet points are real essential to that.
And part of it is, when it comes to student who has accommodations, if the accommodations aren't working, we need to shift those. So we have a lot of things. We have a lot of things that we need to be able to shift, including enrollment options for kids.
Dr. Benton's using the word agile. I'm leaning towards nimble, but I suspect it's a two-way street. I suspect that we're going to have some families who choose online who realize that's not a good fit and want to come back. And I also think that we might have some families who are in person who, because of illness or family dynamics, may choose to discontinue that and move for the online. So our team is aware that that's a strong possibility of occurring, and we're going to work as hard as we can to provide those opportunities. that transcripting at the high school level is probably our biggest challenge to overcome when we have to be nimble or agile.
All right. I'm happy to move into number 4 if we're ready.
Okay, any other questions? Great, thank you.
So number 4 is about staff support and professional learning. And one of the components that we have discussed is, if you see in that responsibilities document, quite a bit that staff are going to learn to do, or shifts they're going to need to make within their classroom, increased routines, and obviously time to get to know their students as well. And so one of the pieces that we've discussed for the return to in-person is adding 2 days as optional days for staff to be able to come back and basically help prep their classroom. And so this is the section that Casey's highlighting. And we really do want to support, equip, and empower our staff to be able to have the knowledge that they need for those safety protocols and procedures. So we'll be getting like groups together as well during the teacher return week between August 12th and 18th to be able to discuss those protocols. So PE teachers and music instructors, science, talking through with elementary staff in terms of access to supplies. Anything that we used to use as a communal supply is more than likely now an individual student supply. And so you can see that we're going to be adding a stipend for teachers to be able to come back for those 2 days, to be able to do room prep, to then be able to be prepared for the learning that's going to occur within that teacher return week. There also is going to be an opportunity for our classified employees to come back as well, because we know that we're going to be working with them to learn some of those protocols. There's a section in here around expectations for staff, where we are returning to in-person in-building work. And then there's some information around the requests for leave, and to be able to contact Bob Foster if there are any concerns, questions, or to apply for that leave. We want to highlight that although we know that some of these increased safety protocols and also increases in expectations for staff to be able to plan for pivoting to remote learning within a 24-hour period, we're still going to make sure that our staff have regular plan time, regular collaborative time, as well as a duty-free lunch.
I'm sorry, you said a duty-free lunch?
Yeah, so that's where teachers have the ability to go and actually have a 30-minute break within their day.
Okay.
Without supervising students.
Yeah, perfect. I didn't hear that word correctly, and that makes perfect sense.
No
Thank
worries.
you.
It's more edge-speak. In terms of remote learning, we do want to make sure that part of our plan for return to in-person is also the opportunity when remote learning has to be basically delivered because of COVID, that our staff have the ability to pivot within a 24-hour time frame, and to make sure that students have resources to do that as well. So they'll be working within the first couple of weeks to instruct students and families on how to access platforms. We've also streamlined expectations, including the platforms we'll be utilizing, as well as standardized formats for those platforms. Casey, if you want to scroll down.
May I ask a question right there, Dr. Bennett? So
Sure.
earlier we had talked about the exclusion criteria, 14-day quarantine for those who might be ill.
Correct.
And that's on an individual basis. You're talking about now remote learning, should we have to close the school, but how do we support the individual that is under quarantine during that quarantine period? Is that built in here? Because I haven't quite seen it spelled out yet.
So it is actually within the responsibilities document that staff will be populating an LMS for each level. So K6 as well as 7, 12. So K6 will be utilizing Google Classroom, and 7, 12 will be utilizing Canvas as our primary LMS. There'll be course blueprints that staff will utilize, so it's easier for all parties to access. And staff will be expected to populate content depending on level. And so that students can access, and just as though they were sick before, but now hopefully that if a kid is out for 2 weeks, they can log into the platform when they're feeling better and be able to access their work.
Any other questions on this section before we move on?
How about substitutes? Do we have enough substitutes in the event that we see a group of teachers or students having to take time?
So one of the recommendations out of our committee in working with principals is what we're calling flexible coverage, where we would utilize in-building staff potentially, if at all possible. Obviously, they'd be compensated for that, as well as the ability to look at, let's say a teacher is quarantined but healthy, being able to remote in and then have a support person within the classroom. So we are looking at a variety of options for staff. We have teachers who, they want to, what does that look like for me? I don't want to rewrite all of my curriculum. I want to be with my kids, especially if I'm feeling better. So those are all questions that we continue to ask and try and seek answers to. We do expect, in terms of substitutes, though, to have, we need to be more flexible in how we go about providing sub coverage. The only other key piece to highlight on this page is the difference between remote learning and online programs. And online programming is the expectation that students are accessing their learning in an online platform. Remote learning is when we have to pivot due to a COVID closure and offer instruction for a short period of time online through a remote learning environment. So they are two separate programs. All right.
Okay, so that takes us to our preparation for the possibility of school closures and reentry contingencies. As we talked earlier, this section of our plan is exactly what El Paso County Health Department is sharing with us in terms of how we have to be prepared in the event of a positive case being reported to El Paso County Health. So you can see sort of this diagram description of what that process looks like. Rather than spend too much time walking through how all these arrows work, what I'm going to dive down into here, and you can see again a link to that public health document. Outbreaks are defined as 2 or more positive COVID-19 cases in non-household members with symptom onsets within a 14-day window. And as you can see, these outbreaks can be limited to a single group or class, which would be considered more of a cohort outbreak. Staff, 2 or more faculty members, or school-wide, 2 or more cohorts within a school meeting the outbreak definition. I do think behind all of that, in light of the fact that every outbreak will be unique and handled on a case-by-case basis in conjunction with public health. Again, this is part of what we will be doing to ensure that we are adhering to those health guidelines and making sure that we have ongoing communication in place to address the next steps. So you can see, and I'm not going to read through each one of these bullets, but in the event of an outbreak, the general procedure would be outlined as follows. So it starts with a single positive case within a school, either a student or a staff member. And you can see that the exclusion of that case is what it's referred to with public health terminology, the exclusion of a cohort group for 14 days. And if no cohorting, the school, in conjunction with public health, will investigate contacts and exclude all involved students and faculty for 14 days. So obviously this, and then subsequent scenarios, creates a real significant aspect of our plan that we just have to be prepared for in the event of a single case or 2 or more confirmed cases, again, within a cohort or a class over a 14-day period. And you can see all of that terminology played out through additional scenarios. I have heard it been talked about, as we have had working groups, that there's not necessarily a mindset of if this happens, but when this happens. So what I would propose is that everything that we have covered before is really, again, an effort to do everything that we possibly can to not only come back in person, but to remain in person for as long as we possibly can. So there's no really good way to know exactly how it's going to happen until we're back in this situation. What I would also say, because I do think there's a lot of emotion, and I mean, we can call it fear that goes into this, is that we have actually been working a few different angles of what we've been doing over the summer, starting with our summer sports and activities that have been in place in large part from June 1st. And without going through every little detail of that, we have managed that plan successfully over the past 6, now going into 7 weeks, and have had great success, great participation, and everyone's been following the guidelines to an extent that we have a great deal of confidence in our ability to execute this plan. We've also been working with our ESY, extended school year student populations, and we've had really good success, both in terms of how our execution of those protocols go, as well as the experiences from a learning angle that our kids are getting. So while on one hand, this is daunting and it feels, certainly it's humbling when you look at this and say, wow, we might start and be in a situation where we have to go toward a school closure for a minimum of 14 days. In the event that the outbreak occurs, we still feel like the best step for us to be able to take as we're going forward is to do everything that we possibly can to prevent that from occurring and execute on the game plan that we have in front of you. So then you can see from the point that we are out of school to the point where we would be coming back to school, you can see the related school closure criteria, or what is referred to as a return to learn decision tree. And you can, again, get a feel for where we currently are in terms of the capacity criteria, as well as how we would approach a green situation versus a yellow versus a red. And so that part where we're at right now is we're in a green situation, and we're working into August 19th, ideally with that same criteria in place. And in the event that we have to move to yellow or red at whatever point in the school year, we're prepared to manage that and prepared to execute on that remote learning scenario. So this is the part of the document which I would tell you is very much informed by public health. You can see a little bit more in terms of contact tracing and how the county would be working with us in terms of identifying contacts and reaching out to them, et cetera. And then you can see a little bit more, again, in regards to how we would implement remote learning in this type of situation. So you've heard the terms agility, nimbleness. So I'll just throw out one more, and that's just the flexibility and the adaptability to all the different situations that we have. And while I finish out this part of the document, this will shift our focus to what is also before the board this evening in the language of a resolution that speaks to the principles that we need to use in order to execute on this plan. And it really comes back to making sure that learning continues to be at the forefront of our focal point in our efforts, understanding that there may be a moment or several moments at whatever given time we're going through the school year where we have to prepare for the implementation of remote learning, in which case we need the ability to count that remote learning environment as part of our hours and instructional minutes that we are still being held accountable to by CDE. So I want to get to that in just a moment, but I want to just one more time stress the final principle of our plan, which is to continue to collaboratively develop, monitor, and revise our plan as we continue to go into the future. So you can see the drivers behind that. You can see the links to the survey data that we spent time on. Again, a kudos to all of our stakeholders that have been hard at work in producing what you have before you this evening, and understanding that, again, we are preparing for every possible scenario and doing so in partnership with our community. So I just can't stress enough how important it is for us to continue to work collaboratively toward that end. Pardon me.
Dr. Summers?
Please.
At the risk of restating the obvious, can I trouble you to scroll back to page 13, please?
Of course.
And I have the advantage of having a printed copy in front of me, just so I can see it.
Oh, look, showing off. So is Miss Upchurch.
She obviously printed hers first.
Please, sir.
What percent of all the stuff you went through on pages 13 through 17 are mandated by our Department of Health that really has controlling authority over a lot of the stuff we do?
100%.
Okay. That's really important for us to ensure the public is aware of that. The team and the staff are working really hard to toggle between every piece of flexibility we have and what we have no flexibility for. So kudos to you and the team for working really, really hard to do that and for providing choices for our families and our students.
Thanks for calling that out. That is a very critical component of how all of this is coming together. And I would also just elevate, as a side note to that our partnership, continued partnership, or blossoming one, if you want to look at it that way, with our public health department is one of the features of our response to this pandemic that I think is just a sign of how we're all working collectively and collaboratively in such a way that, I understand there's a lot of different districts in our local community that all are also on that same page, but it speaks a lot to the county's commitment, or the health department's commitment to supporting us and acknowledging that there are some variances to some extent, but there are some bottom lines that they cannot move that target based on the situation that we're dealing with. So just a lot of sensitivity to all that across the board.
So Dr. Summers, thank you for the information. And I think you somewhat touched on this, but I just want to be clear. So if you have a student in high school and one student within a cohort group tests positive for COVID-19 or displays symptoms, what is the plan of notifying other parents for students not in that cohort group, or if it is, or similar situation if you're dealing with elementary age kids where, for example, a first grader displays the symptoms? Do we in turn notify every parent in that school, or would it just be all the kids that interact with that the child with the high temperature displaying the signs that are in question?
Honestly, Mr. Klassen, the best way for me to answer that is the starting point is a conversation with public health. We typically are not the notifying party at the very beginning in terms of who else needs to be notified and contacted. That's a partnership that we would start down that road in terms of making sure that we can accurately provide the information that public health is looking for at that point. And then to the extent that they are the ones that are individually notifying individuals who may be impacted versus a school-wide communication that is going out. Obviously, we would be the ones that are doing the school-wide notification within the district. But in terms of a more individualized conversation, my understanding at this time is that would come more through public health. So I hope that answered your question.
Okay, then the next question is, how would public health obtain the information for all students within a given class or a school?
From us. We share that information with them at that point.
Okay.
They would be working with us, Mr. Klassen. So an example would be, can you tell me more about what type of exposure other students had within the window of time that they're looking at? So we may be looking at rosters at that point. We may be looking at a number of details, and what they may be telling us is, here's who we need to talk to at a deeper level versus here's what we need to say to an entire school. And you can see pretty quickly why the cohorting is a component that we have to be prepared for, but particularly at a high school environment, it becomes, if that student potentially had access to multiple students, both through their classes as well as lunch or any other time during the day, we're looking at a pretty significant number at that point. So we would want to almost retrace those steps, and public health would give us more specific guidance exactly on what they need from that and what we need to be able to provide them.
Right, and that's consistent with my understanding. I guess one concern that I have is if the numbers increase and public health is overwhelmed, Have we contemplated any options for being a little more nimble as a district and dealing with individual schools to address these issues if public health is not available, say for a couple of days?
I think we're going to do everything we possibly can on our end to not only ensure that we're following that guidance from public health, but also communicating to our families in a timely manner. So I think, yes, we're prepared for that. And I think this, if I can just say it this way, this is probably the most stressful aspect of what we're preparing for, is in the event of an outbreak, how do we make sure that we're communicating in a timely and sensitive manner and consistently so that everyone can get the information that they need as quickly as we possibly can. So I guess my final answer to all that is yes, we're going to do everything that we can on our end. And I still want to make sure that we're doing it according to the guidance that public health is providing.
Perfect. Thank you.
It's a great question.
Matt, that was an excellent question. If I understand, we're going to make sure, I guess it's a follow-up question. In the event that has to happen, how or can we protect as much student information as possible?
If you're referring to protecting information, student information from the health department, I don't want to read too much into the question.
Yes.
Public health and us share that personally identifiable information insofar as it's contact information. Here's the phone number, here's the name, here's the information that we can provide when it comes to what they're looking for. So that agreement is protected by law because we're dealing with a public health crisis at that point. We're only sharing it though with the health department, and anything that they're sharing with us, conversely, is protected in the relationship between our two agencies. So we're both held to the same level of confidentiality in that, where it can't go any further than our two respective organizations. Did that answer that, Ms. Upchurch?
Yep.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions. And I may have overlooked my first two. Was the substitute teacher population included in the survey? And part two of that is, do we anticipate utilizing substitute teachers? How?
So the substitutes were not sent the survey. The survey was for employees, not that substitutes aren't employees, but they're considered temporary employees. So the survey was sent to anyone with the Lewis-Palmer domain, which is not considered a temporary employee. In terms of substitutes, we do expect to have regular substitutes, and that's where the concept of the 6 feet and being able to socially distance and also training our substitutes on our protocols is really important.
And then my other sort of over-encompassing question is, Dr. Summers, where in this plan I'm sort of merging the last 2 months, the CARES Act money, where do you see that being implemented as it applies to this plan here tonight?
Well, I can speak to one immediate point that we covered through the staff support principle, which was the 2 additional days, which gives our staff the option of coming in a couple of days early to set their classrooms up, et cetera, as well as maximize the time that we have in that teacher return week with teachers as well as classified staff for training purposes. That additional dollar amount is coming directly from our CARES funding. That is something that is allowable under CARES use. I would tell you that every resource in terms of cleaning supply, signage, where we need to purchase personal protective equipment, other materials and resources that are part of how we're executing on this plan, that will all be coded to CARES. I will go one step further and say almost anything that within reason we can articulate as a need that is a function of how this plan is being developed and executed is coming from CARES. And as I say all this, I'm wondering if Shanna is also available just to share out any other updates from the financial department.
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me?
We can, thank you.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we are doing a very detailed dive into what is allowable under CARES funding, as well as the continued changes that keep coming down, additional guidance, more detail. My resources team has helped to kind of dig through those details, make sure that we're all on the same page regarding the interpretation of that. And so there are things such as some additional instructional time that we'll be able to cover in the fall that relates to the time lost in the spring. So we are waiting on a little bit more guidance from the CDE on how to calculate that out, as well as all the purchases of thermometers and masks and such as Dr. Summers said regarding cleaning supplies, anything and everything that is related to COVID, we can code to those CARES monies. And we are tracking that in a very detailed fashion through our finance team right now.
Thanks, that's helpful. And just to clarify the timeline, any of that CARES money coming to our district is applicable through December 31st. Is that still the case?
Yes,
okay.
That is correct.
Thank you.
One other point, Shannon, do you mind just also sharing the dynamic around, we are allocating as a starting point a specific dollar amount per student for every school to be able to utilize as well. So recognizing that, yeah, go ahead, thanks.
Yeah, so that was another idea that came through the different teams that have worked through this whole back to school plan, and was that we assign an amount that is discretionary to the principals. So if they were to come across a need for their campus that was, campus specific, that they would have some funding already available to them. And so we did apply a dollar amount per student based on what's budgeted to each of those campuses so that they have some discretionary funding to spend. They've been given the guidelines to make sure that we're still staying within the CARES requirements. And again, we will be tracking all of that backup documentation in the case of an audit, so that should we get audited, we are in full compliance with everything that is needed to show that how we spent that money and that it was all within the guidelines set forth for it.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Shana, since you're still on, can you speak to, is per pupil revenue the same for online education as it is for in-person education?
Yes, I believe so.
Dr. Benton, did you want to add a line to that?
So there's a different enrollment process in terms of documentation of online students. I can't recall the exact number, but I actually think we get a little bit more based on the state allocation for online than for actual in-person, just because we're floor funded as in-person.
Thank you.
At the risk of also just drawing our attention to the resolution, Mr. Clausen, is that a good time to just make sure that you all have an opportunity to have any discussion around the resolution language, or would you rather that wait until the special meeting part of the agenda?
Well, considering it's a special meeting agenda, if you don't have any objections, I'd prefer to keep it as a separate agenda item.
Yeah, that's not a problem. I did want to call out, if I can, though, the fact that the way that we're accounting for our instructional minutes and the fact that our students will be engaged in an educational process, that affords them the flexibility, as well as the district the flexibility, to count those minutes, which ultimately translates to how we're counting our full-time equivalent status. All those pieces connect. All the resolution language really does is it allows us to count more than just the in-person learning time as we're going into the 2021 school year, which, as you all know, because of the unique circumstances, that's the purpose of that resolution, is really to ensure that we are on solid ground, where we're not necessarily having to completely adjust policy, but we're saying, for the purposes of this upcoming school year, this is how we're going to count time, and this is how that translates to being able to demonstrate to CDE that we are within the bounds of the flexibility that they're allowing for us. So just in the event that there's any questions around that, that's the ultimate intent of that resolution.
Thank you, Dr. Summers.
Before we move on, can I make one more request? Or I guess one more statement. For the frequently asked questions page, I think it would be valuable if folks have questions, that frequently asked questions page on our website, that they know that they can go there, and if there's not a question that's answered, then it's an opportunity to engage in that discussion. Like I think of an example of why aren't we doing a hybrid program? Well, because we don't have the bandwidth or the resources this is what we have. And I think I think our options that we're offering families are good options, especially considering what we have.
So thank you for bringing that point up. And what I will tell you is we actually have a starting point of that FAQ that's already pretty well detailed. We hesitated to link all of that all at once through this document, but that will be updated on our website as we continue to go forward through the remainder of the week. And Ms. Stefan, are you on as well? Do you want to just add any other comment regarding that? If you're there, sorry, I didn't mean to call you out, but we're working on it, would be my response. So it has a feel like we're kind of winding down here. So Mr. Klassen, if there's anything else, we're happy to respond to, but I also know we still have some other topics here.
I have one more thing, if I could. Dr. Summers, what of this plan applies to our students and the staff at the charter school?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is the charter is in a position where their educational process and approach is under their purview when it comes to how they set up everything from their learning environment to how they're creating their day in, day out sort of activities, et cetera. They are also held accountable to any local law or state law that's in place. So they have to make sure that they are developing guidelines that are consistent with what laws are in place, and that they are going to have to communicate that information to their families in the manner that they see best. We're here to help provide support in the way of resource, and certainly they can align to a lot of what we have developed as part of our plan. I would also add that we have had charter school representation in our working groups, which I think has been beneficial on both sides. But in terms of the way this plan will be communicated, and then the enrollment form that we're asking our families to complete, that enrollment form is specific to families that are attending our D38 traditional schools, and the charter would do their own process for how they're getting that information for any families that are signing up and planning on attending Monument Academy, either their elementary or secondary program.
Thanks.
Yep.
All right, any additional questions? All right, moving on to the next agenda item, strategic plan discussion. Mr. Taylor, would you be gracious enough to start us off?
I would, thank you. So I guess I'm going to start this by talking about the strategic plan. We put together a draft earlier this year, and there were 5 areas: cultivate a safe and healthy, welcoming school environment, ensure high quality instruction and relevant education experiences for all students, deepen our professional learning culture and shared commitments to continuous growth, effectively use assets and efficient use of resources, and then forging a strong community relationship and foster effective communication with all stakeholders. Within the first couple, there's a couple line items that are more specific to this topic. One is ensure equitable, diverse, and culturally responsive learning environments. Prioritize a feeling of welcome and inclusivity for all students and families. And in the second one, it talks about a strengthened, responsive teaching and learning environment that meets the needs of all students. Further, our ongoing commitment to educating the whole child. And I think my point would be that the strategic plan that we worked on before the pandemic and before the social unrest that exists today began, I think we already had in place within the strategic plan the items of equitable opportunity, inclusivity, and diverse and culturally responsive learning environments. So I'm not sure that we need to add a lot to our strategic plan because it appears to me that it already exists. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for the fact that we're not being reactive to a current situation, whether it's the pandemic and or the social unrest that has followed that. So, for me, I appreciate the board. I've never seen within our board anything but a commitment to these goals and these priorities. So I'll start it off with that. That's what I believe. So I think the elements of our strategic plan already contain very pointedly and very explicitly any items relative to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and more.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Any other comments?
If not, I would just add one thing that I've requested in the past, and that is, as we put our board meeting agendas together, an alignment with our strategic goals would always help us walk the talk better. I would also ask for consideration among my fellow board members that each of us lead one of those 5 areas currently, and each of us, team with another board member in another area. And perhaps in the future, we just consider that our board member comments could relate somewhat to those areas of our strategic plan that we're mostly focused on. I think it would, again, I'm trying to get us as a leadership body to walk the talk of our strategy and try and incorporate within our report, if you will, some of the things that are relative to that strategic plan. Having said that, I recognize that the last few months haven't been normal. And so I'm not trying to call anyone out. I'm just trying to reinforce the concept that, as we move forward with our strategic plan, which we will, and this pandemic will end, there will be a new normal. I don't know what it might look like, but I have a lot of faith that this current situation is temporary. So I want us to keep our eyes on the long term, on the big picture, and I want our school district, right, to really have the reality that our strategic plan speaks to.
So, Mr. Clausen, may I piggyback on what Mr. Taylor just said?
Absolutely, Mr. Schwartz.
Thank you. What I'd like to propose is once we get to an semblance of a normal cadence, that we have each working leader from the board once every 90 days give a readout on their progress, and specifically so we hold each other accountable to move the ball forward, that we don't put too much weight on the staff, and that we do our share to deliver the results of the plan to the students and their families. That's why we're here.
It's a wonderful suggestion, and I would concur with your recommendation.
Thank you.
Can I piggyback on Mr. Schwartz, please?
I'm not sure I can handle it
Oh.
at this late hour.
I think holding ourselves accountable is essential to being better and growing together as board members, as a district, and as a community for our kids, for the whole child and for all of our kids. On a personal level, dang it, I want to make a difference in the lives of our students, on all of our students, regardless of who they are and where they come from and what strengths and weaknesses they have. I really want to be intentional in making a difference in the lives of our students and in our district, and being better and holding ourselves, not resting on our laurels. And I think a strategic plan continues to push that forward so that there's a vision and a goal. It's not just reactionary, and it's not, it's intentional, and it's purposeful, and it's meaningful.
I think it's well said, Tiffany. I think also, as any part of a strategic plan, I think it's, somewhat of a forward-moving document at times, and maybe not that we're changing the words, but just being responsive to our stakeholders and collaborating in a way when we see apt opportunity. I think there will come times like that can be really beneficial and great opportunities. So that I would encourage all of us to recognize those when they occur.
Thank you, Ms. Phillips. Any other questions or comments on this topic?
Mr. Clausen, if I may.
Absolutely, Dr. Summers.
One of the things that I know we spent time discussing as these goals and priorities were established was a recognition that this was really a starting point for where that roadmap toward achievement and success, if we want to call it that, lands. And so recognizing that, for example, in a priority around ensuring equitable, diverse, and culturally responsive learning environments, that's a lot in one statement that I think warrants additional consideration from a place of what objectives are we striving for in that space. Based on the objectives that we identify, how do we measure what progress and what success looks like? How do we make sure that we are also able to execute on what those steps involve? So that's really the action orientation that we have yet to completely delineate. I think we have the intent toward that, which I think is a great starting point. Now, what do we need to do to begin to help move our steps toward what ultimately we're trying to achieve there. So I think some of that is defining our terms. I think when we talk about the topic of diversity and equity and inclusion, I think helping make sure that we can operationalize that term or those terms and what they present as within our classrooms, within our schools, within our community. There's an opportunity there to make sure that we're all working off of the same page, so to speak. I think also making sure that we're cognizant of who it is that we're talking about. So, for example, what type of staff training and resources are necessary for us to be able to execute on that objective, whatever that is that we're striving for. Obviously, that requires a level of engagement with our staff and with our community. I also want to make sure that we're very mindful of where our student voices and experiences are in this process, because I think our students have a lot that they can share with us as we're becoming more specific about the steps that we're taking and really identifying more of the needs. I think that's the true test that we need to make sure that we're willing as a leadership team to address and respond to. I want to make sure that this plan is representative and reflective of those needs, and recognizing that they may be diverse needs that we're working to address in that process as well. I say all this because I think the amount of time and engagement that's going to take is something we're going to have to be very intentional about, particularly as we're working in our current context. If I can for a moment, looking at our strategic plan, the priority that's listed right above that is ensure comprehensive crisis planning and emergency preparedness for any situation. Well, clearly everything I think that we're doing within our return to school, back to school plan is an example of what level of detail and the amount of work and energy that's associated with that is going to take in order to produce a plan that reflects that aspiration. So as I say that, I just want to be conscientious of the fact that not that this is necessarily a competing priority, but it just involves time. It involves ample planning to ensure that we're capable of delivering on what that plan involves. And at this point, if I were to add one more thing to the training plate on our teachers, that would be disrespectful to what the lift is that they're having to come back into the beginning of the year to do. At the same time, when I look at how we're trying to prioritize, for example, social emotional learning supports and support for individual student needs, there may be an opportunity window there to say what is embedded as part of that effort around SEL support, as an example, where we can prioritize aspects of diversity, aspects of equity, and inclusion into our plan. And as you know, we've been very intentional in aligning our plan to addressing equity as well as a level of coherence across the board. So I just wanted to give a little bit of voice to that, because a lot of what we're after is absolutely where we should be directing our time, our talent, our energy. But it's also a lift that we're just going to have to be conscientious of and make sure that we're doing it well, and we're doing it from a place of recognizing where our individual stakeholder needs are in that continuum. So again, I think we're aiming towards something that is the right intent, but there's a lot more steps that we just have to make sure that we're really thoughtful about. And as you know, we are here to support that process and to make sure that we are making forward momentum or progress toward what we're striving for. But I look at the entirety of this year as, what do we want to accomplish between now and, well, let's just say, where do we envision ourselves by the end of next June? And that might be one strategy for our board. And then as a result, thinking about it at a district leadership level as well as a community level, and then down to every school. What is a backwards by design process that we can implement so that whatever we're striving to accomplish by June, we can begin to say, here's what it's going to take for us to invest the right amount of time and resource and energy to get closer to where that mark is, recognizing that the work will always be something that we're striving for. So thanks for letting me give some voice to those pieces.
Well, I appreciate that. And you brought up a lot of wonderful points, Dr. Summers, and perhaps in the upcoming work session meeting, we could spend a little more time on the strategic plan and address some of the items and concerns that you have and prioritize the limited resources that we have to get the pendulum moving forward.
Might I add?
Well, Chris, do you want to go first or do you want me to go first?
You go ahead.
So I would just add that we have the ability to ensure that it's also a collaborative effort too, and that we are leaning in and all voices are heard at the table while we're doing this.
Perfect. And I would just say that, Casey, the experience of the last 3 months on ensuring a comprehensive crisis planning and emergency preparedness for any situation is a great foundation for us to build upon in every other line item within each of these goals. And I hope that that's one of the takeaways, is this wasn't just a one-time, COVID pandemic, but we actually use everything that you and your administration and everyone, even stakeholders, as Tiffany says, this has been as collaborative of an effort as I've witnessed. And if we can use that pattern, I think then our school system within D38 will reflect the values and the priorities of our community. And that I think it'll be proud work that we can be a part of.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Are there any other comments?
I also want to elevate and lift up the energy and the sacrifice and the hours of work that Dr. Summers has put forth throughout this summer, and so many of the staff and stakeholders, and the passion and dedication and vision. So I don't even know how to say thank you appropriately, but thank you.
We really appreciate that sentiment, all of the support that our board continues to provide. I would just also add that this is a fantastic team. I am honored and humbled to work with such dedicated and passionate individuals across the board. And so it helps make my job manageable or doable. And we have missed working with all of our students, our staff, and our community in more of an in-person format. But as we talked about tonight, we're working really intently on getting back to that. And you're going to continue to get that same level of commitment from myself and from each of us. So thank you for calling that out. And it's humbling. And obviously we're doing it to serve our students, our staff, and our families. So thank you.
All right. If there's nothing else, let's move on to board member comments. Ms. Upchurch, can we start with you?
I've thought a lot about my board member comments and what I wanted to say. And honestly, I have a hard time reflecting on it without crying. I appreciate all the effort and all the voices, and there's been a lot of passion and a lot of hard work, like I said. I go back to my own parental perspective and advocacy as a mom, and I see so much work and so much growth that we need to do as a school district and as a community. And I do think that we can grow and learn. And I think that we as a community are capable and up to the task. And I think working through these trying and unprecedented times is a prime example. people come from different perspectives and different ideas, but there is that common ground, and we are working together in equity, and I think everybody's committed to being better, just being better. As the mom of a that's had to advocate for a child that's faced his own bullying growing up, and as the mom who's had to advocate, my heart is particularly responsive, or particularly, I'm there. I get it. I see it and I understand it. And all of our children are, that's where we're doing this, is for our kids. And I was, on Saturday, I was a part of a group of women leaders in Pikes Peak region, and we recreated the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And this is the year that's been 100 years. And it made me do a lot of reflection and a lot of thought into how far we've come and how far we still have to go. And we'll get through this. I guess that's all I have to say right now, is I look forward to, I am afraid too, because I have a senior in high school right now, that I appreciate the graduation that we were able to have for our students, but things are different right now. And so we do the best we can. And that's from the heart and from the hip. And I don't know how to say what needs to be said without strong way. So I guess that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Ms. Upchurch. Ms. Phillips?
Thanks. I just, having been involved with the reopening of the schools project since I think about June 1st, with 4 working groups and a steering committee, so many people involved, hundreds of hours of effort. I just want to, again, Casey, thank your team, thank our community, and just say that it's taken a lot of patience on all ends. It's going to require more patience moving forward, I think. We have a survey coming out. We're going to need that information back in order to lay out the final plans. So I think of it more in terms of a positive feedback loop. And if it all works, we are safeguarding everyone in our neighborhood and in our community. And it might even come down to saving someone out of the ICU or saving a life. So it's that important. And as tough as it has been, even for me personally at times, in terms of patience, and sometimes feels like slogging through mud, I think that it's an effort that's been really, really thorough. And I just appreciate everybody who's invested in it. And I would say almost everybody in the community is invested in it. And we've heard from so many people on a number of topics, and those thoughtful and respectful communications with us are important, and we really appreciate it. I don't think I have anything else for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Phillips. Mr. Schwartz?
Well, we're at pretty close to 3.5 hours, so brevity is key here. All I'd like to say is anybody can sail a ship through smooth waters, but it's really the tough times that defines where your quality people are and exactly who they are, what their character is, and how they come through for others. And the teams that built this plan did it in addition to whatever their day jobs and other obligations were. They came through on time. They built a quality product, and they provided our community some level of choice and control in an environment where there isn't a lot. Thank you guys for doing that. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Mr. Taylor?
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to make a very brief statement. I don't normally write them up, but I did tonight. Dr. Summers and all who have helped. Lewis Palmer School District 38 provides the privilege of learning according to the dictates of your own conscience by enabling all parents and students to learn how, where, or what they choose. Thank you, Dr. Summers.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I'd like to concur with the comments made by my fellow board members. Also want to especially thank Ms. Phillips and Ms. Upchurch for being the board representatives on the steering committee. I know that in addition to your responsibilities professionally and at home, you've taken a fair amount of time to assist the incredible team that we have here in District 38. So I also want to thank our district team and everyone that's made this plan come forward. And I also want to thank our community members for the insights and recommendations that they have offered. So with that being said, Dr. Summers, we'll turn the time over to you.
I don't have a whole lot more to add other than we appreciate the kind words and recognition. And as I said earlier, we will continue to go forward with our focus on doing everything that we possibly can to safely and responsibly return to a successful 2020-21 school year. Our students are depending on that. Our families deserve that. And you will continue to get nothing but our very best. And we appreciate that there's a lot that we're still adapting to. So that year of agility and the nimbleness and the flexibility, thanks for your patience and grace with us as we continue to go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Summers. This concludes the portion of our work session meeting. Now we'll enter into our special meeting. First agenda item is approve resolution affirming district fundamental responsibilities in response to COVID-19. I believe all board members should have had the opportunity to review the resolution. I guess as one housekeeping item, it's typically our board policy that we go through 2 readings. I note that we have another work session meeting, the first part of, I think it's August 10th or 11th. Correct me if I'm wrong, Vicki or Kathy.
It's the 11th.
It's the 11th. So I guess right off the bat, Dr. Summers, I will ask you, is this a resolution that could wait until then so we give the public ample opportunity to review it and give us their input, or is it something that you're asking us to act on tonight?
I really appreciate that question. I would say that I do believe we could afford forwarding the official or second reading of this into the August 11th meeting. I would also add that one of the dimensions that we were working through this past week was we were not aware of any CASB updates around specific aspects of this language until late on Friday. CASB did come through with a sample draft resolution. It's pretty similar. So if we felt like we really could force or needed to this resolution through, I think this would suffice, but it would give us some cushion and some time to make any adjustments that we feel are necessary. And I think so long as we have it intact before the start of school, which August 11th would give us that that cushion there, I think we could do that. So sorry for the long-winded answer. The bottom line is, yes, I do think we could postpone an official vote until the following work session meeting.
Okay. What questions, comments, and concerns do you have regarding the proposed resolution?
I, for one, would support the August 11th vote.
Okay.
I think that August 11th is appropriate. This is just, we do have policies in place as well. And I do understand the importance of this and the impact that it has as things continue to change and be fluid. So I'd say sooner than later for sure.
I guess my only question would be, if something strange happens that we can't meet on that date, we need to make sure this is completed so the district has the agility to perform the tasks that are on this resolution in the event that they need to. So I'm fine with moving it. I just I want to make sure we don't delay it past then.
Okay, I appreciate that. All right, any additional comments regarding this resolution? Okay, Ms. Namika, if you'd kindly add that as an agenda item to our August 11th work session meeting.
Certainly.
Okay, and Dr. Summers, if you would kindly get a copy of the updated resolution to us as early as possible. And I understand you mentioned there were some minor changes, but if we're going to vote on it, perhaps we could look at some options of once I've contacted each board member and obtained their approval or support for the motion. And once again, each board member individually, perhaps there would be a way that we could get it out and get some public feedback. So just a thought there.
Absolutely.
All right, is there any additional business that we need to conduct during our special meeting? Okay, with that being said, this concludes our special meeting. Now I'd like to make a motion to convene an executive session in accordance to CRS 24.6-402 section FI to discuss a personnel matter.
Second.
Okay, any questions, comments, concerns? Okay. I note that it is 9:30 according to my clock. At the conclusion of the executive session, I will briefly come back on the record and indicate what time the executive session has concluded. So with that being said, we will log off and enter into executive session. And just bear with me, please.
Mr. Clausen, do we need to vote?
We do, thank you. Just 1 second, please. All right, perfect. Ms. Namika, would you take the vote, please?
Mr. Clausen.
Aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Mr. Schwartz.
Aye.
Mr. Taylor.
Aye.
Ms. Upchurch.
Aye.
All right, thank you. With that being said, we will log off and enter into executive session. Thank you. Hey, Ms. Namika?
Yes, sir.
All right, it is 10:03. Our executive session concluded around 10 p.m. Is that correct, Ms. Upchurch?
That is correct.
Okay. There will be no more business conducted this evening, and our special meeting / work session stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you, ladies.